One.
All right, guys, so we're going to make our way through the notes together. So if you could just follow along and make sure you fill things in as we go slide from slide. So the main guiding idea here, what we're going to try to accomplish, is talk about where the Industrial Revolution started, what were the factors that contributed to bringing it into being, and ultimately why it started in the place that it did. So to start, just take a minute to look at this piece of artwork and try to think whether it's impressionistic, realistic, or romantic. Think about it, and we'll talk about it in class to get started next session. All right, here's where the notes begin. So the Industrial Revolution, for the purpose of getting a definition, basically means the period in time in which machines greatly increased output and humans were ultimately able to consume those finished products. They were no longer made in the home, they were now made in factories, which had plenty of benefits, but like we'll learn about, also a lot of negatives. All right, so historians disagree about the ultimate starting date. It's not one of those things where ultimately one day somebody was like, oh, it's the Industrial Revolution. Historians put the starting date at different times, and in many cases, some people argue about the specific place too. All right, so the first thing that we need to discuss is why people were able to sustain life during this period. Health increased, birth rates increased, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that agriculture improved. So an important facet of the Industrial Revolution is to understand that the agricultural revolution came first. So one of the most important movements was the enclosure movement throughout Great Britain and much of Europe. It was the idea that instead of growing things in these giant manors, you could actually privately own property, grow things on there on your own, and it led to incentive basically to grow more crops on smaller areas, to grow better crops than your neighbor because you could increase your profit. And of course, if you were just farming for sustenance, you'd survive better. So it promoted a lot of ingenuity and a lot of entrepreneurship in terms of farming techniques, and ultimately was one of the things that set off the agricultural revolution. Following it up, and we talked about this in class, was the use of crop rotation. People were able to scientifically prove and now finally understand that you couldn't just grow the same crops year in and year out. You benefit from putting tuber plants in the same soil where legumes might have been the year before, because it allows the nutrients to basically replenish themselves from one crop year to the next and provides a healthier yield. It allows the soil to be more sustainable and just promotes more output in terms of crops. So the other thing that I want to contribute to this, and then we didn't talk about in class, was the use of selective breeding. So when farmers started to selectively breed their livestock, they were able to take the biggest, strongest animals and basically procreate with those. So the size of meat-producing animals actually increased significantly during this period. So it's pretty interesting to think about the fact like a cow today is probably significantly bigger than cows would have been genetically about 400 years ago. The same is true with chickens. Some of our meat-producing chickens today, a lot of people say it's unethical. Our chickens are raised so quickly to produce meat that they actually can't support themselves on their legs. In a lot of cases, the legs will break because the animals have been so selectively reproduced. And also, hormones and stuff like that, other genetic improvements or detriments, depending on your view, have also made them get a little bit bigger much quicker. But these two things in particular, or three things: crop rotation, enclosing, and selective breeding, allowed for greater output of food prior to the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so we introduced these two theories in yesterday's class. We talked about the ethnocentric or Eurocentric view, and the revisionist view. They disagree on why the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain, but there's a handful of things here that they both agree on. Number one, water power and coal was needed to fuel the machines, and Great Britain, because they had coal available to them and plentiful resources, was the prime location to take advantage of that. Iron ore allowed the machines to be constructed and maintained. And rivers, of course, were important because it allowed you to readily transport these things. And there was no interstate road system. like we would have today in the United States, and of course, no air travel. So rivers were really critical for the transport of goods and in many cases ideas, like we'll talk about in class over the next week or two. All right. And then they could also ship internationally because they had deep water ports. Great Britain, also interestingly enough, had not been in a major war for a long time, except for the American Revolution. That's kind of our prerogative. But in the grand scheme of things, that was not a major conflict. So they weren't suffering and trying to rebuild from a major conflict like much of the rest of Europe was during this period. They also had an intricate banking system, which basically meant you didn't have to walk around with cash all the time. You could walk around like today. We would have an ATM card, or you could use credit cards. You can transfer currency digitally. They, of course, didn't have that luxury. But unlike most of the Western world, you didn't have to rely on precious metals or carrying cash with you from point A to point B. You could use banking services to transfer money more readily. And that fluidity of capital allowed a lot of the ideas and investments to occur that really brought the Industrial Revolution into its heyday. All right, and then of course, they also had an intricate legal system which supported businesses and business owners that we'll be exploring over the next couple weeks as well. If you want to stop and just think about these questions here, that's totally up to you. We'll tackle most of these things in class, but if you just keep up with the notes, you'll be all set. All right, so as we talk about the inventions and how they all kind of built on each other, we'll think back to class the other day when we talked about the most important inventions in your lifetime. If you notice, most of the inventions, quote unquote, were actually just improvements on previous inventions, smartphones, self-driving cars, so on and so forth. All those people are doing, and I'm not downplaying it, is they're taking an existing technology and they're making it better. Through the early days of the Industrial Revolution, that was pretty much the same phenomenon. So the big industry that really started the Industrial Revolution, if you wanted to pinpoint one, I would argue was the textile industry. So you went from people largely producing their own clothing and whatever else you could make from textiles in the home to being able to fabricate them in factories and then sell them to the people themselves for cheaper than they'd be able to do on their own. So there's a couple spinning machines that we're going to talk about that actually spools the thread that was used to create these fabrics, and then also the shuttle machines that were used to weave it. So let's take a look here. This is a very primitive one. I'm just going to let it play for a second as I kind of describe it. So what's happening in this video, if it comes up. All right, perfect. So what you're seeing here is this person is, of course, I'll have to play this video for you in class, but let me just try to explain it in person here. So what happens is this person is going to move this board in and out, and as they do that, in between each movement, what's happening is this shuttle, if you guys have ever done a shuttle run in gym class where you go back and forth, is going to, it's called a flying shuttle because it goes back and forth in between those weaving boards, and it allows that cross-stitch pattern to be made. And if you look down at your shirt right now while you're reading this or watching this, you can actually see that pattern there. All right, so a couple other machines were important in terms of spooling thread. This is James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, named after his daughter. And if you notice, the oblong shape of this wheel here would make it so you could push it. And then I guess that would be centrifugal force, maybe, ask your science teacher, would keep that wheel spinning for a fair amount of time. And what would happen is the person could spool onto the threads the either wool or in some cases cotton that you were using to make the thread out of. All right. So the important thing to note from this is as one group, and this is a totally mechanized spinning mule. This is the same thing that you saw in the video a couple clips ago. It basically just has the machine doing the spooling itself, so you don't have to spin it on your own. All right, let me just get to this last point. So each one of these inventions, the important thing I want you to note, it made the previous invention obsolete, okay? So that's where we're gonna wrap up this video. So if you want to just finish up the notes here, the rest of the notes we'll either pick up in class or in an upcoming video next week. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and let me know if you have questions in class.